Thanks for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell, and on today's episode, we bring back a trio that are no strangers to Ontario growers, particularly in the southwest part of the province, where Gibberella ear rot continues to be on growers' minds, and where tar spot is slowly marching into new territories each year, presenting the potential for devastating yield losses. The good news, with the help of these three included, we're learning more and more about how to successfully protect our yield and grain quality through a series of management strategies. We've got John Seliga and Greg Stopps, both Pioneer Area Agronomists, with John covering the southwest of Ontario and Greg covering north of London up into Midwestern Ontario. And Albert Tenuta is a plant pathologist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and AgriBusiness. John, Greg, Albert, thanks for joining the podcast.
Good morning.
Good to
Thank
be
you.
here. Thanks,
I'm going to start with you, John, because one of the episodes we did a couple of years ago really was almost, for me, it was an introduction to tar spot, right? For Southern Ontario growers, for me anyway, it wasn't something we had dealt with before. It was an interesting conversation to say, okay, you have to look out for this. And my goodness, were you right? Because did it ever come in with a fury in southwestern Ontario in 2023? Give me an idea of over the last couple of years, John, in your area in southwestern Ontario, what have you seen and what have you learned with just what tar spot can do to a corn crop?
Sure. Definitely, all of the territory that I cover today, for the most part, is now infected. There's natural inoculum out there. Of course, I'm in the deep southwest portion of the province, but it's incredible how quickly it spread across the area in those last couple of years. And what's amazing is how quickly you can go from a crop that looks like it's mildly infected with a few stroma on it to 7 to 14 days. You can start seeing necrotic tissue on plants starting to shut down. That's all dependent on their natural tolerance levels, but it really has changed the way growers look to manage the crop. They are well aware of it in my geography, and I know that it's moving east, but we are well aware of how that disease needs to be managed in our part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Albert, when you look at some of the hard numbers that you've seen as you've kind of introduced a lot of the research into what can and can't help deal with tar spot, give me an idea. Has the impact surprised you, or what's the impact looked like over the last couple of years in the trials you've done?
Yeah, as John mentioned, there's tar spot is here, but it changes on an annual basis, right? So the weather conditions will drive a lot of that, right? And play a significant role and influence our annual risk, but also, as John mentioned, our regional risk as well. So tar spot continues to spread in the province, and we've seen that from 2021 up to now as well. And with that, you get a range of severity and risk. So those lower risk areas continue to be that central to eastern Ontario. That's not to say that tar spot's not there, but just at this point, it's one that's of concern, and all growers in those areas should be aware of it as well. But as of right now, the conditions have not been favorable yet. So the risk levels are there. But when you get into, say, Greg's area now we're starting to see those moderate risk areas there, and you're starting to see that again this year, starting to come now, particularly over the past couple of weeks with those favorable conditions. And then John, of course, we're in the southwest, that North Shore Lake area. That's the hotspot. That's the high risk area. So when it comes to tar spot, and what we've seen over the past since its introduction in late 2020 is that we have a range of severity, a range of risk, but things will change, and weather conditions will play a significant role in that. And that means the differences between those 5 bushel yield losses or 0 to 5 to those 20, 30, 40 bushels that we've seen. And unfortunately, in our plots right now, over the past couple of weeks, we've been really seeing tar spots starting to wrap up again, very similar to what we saw in 2021.
I want to come back to you, Albert, in a second to kind of talk about what you found in terms of what weather conditions are really impacting it the most. But he kind of gave you the introduction, Greg, for your area. You cover a little bit north of where John is. Give me an idea of what you've seen, because it's kind of the introduction this year, really, into what tar spot is, and is it surprising growers in your area?
So I think it is going to surprise growers in our area to a degree. I cover, like you say, the north of John, kind of north end of London along Lake Huron, which for the last couple of years, we've had the luxury of not seeing too much tar spot. Tar spot we've seen has come in relatively late and not had an impact on our crop. We've seen it typically kind of into the second, third week of September, well past dead stage in our corn. And in an environment where typically there now, a little further north, we're running out of frost-free days. The environment is changing. We're not seeing some of those conditions conducive to rapid increase of tar spot. So we've escaped some of that, and we haven't seen that early infection. But over the last couple of years, as we've seen that late infection, I think some of that pressure has been there. That overwintering capability is now there. And this year we started to see environmental conditions conducive, and sure enough, infection kind of the end of June, early July, and things have plodded along fairly slowly, and still now are continuing to ramp up, and the environment's perfect for it. There's pockets kind of through Perth, Huron, and no doubt up into Bruce and Grey as well that are going to show it a lot heavier this year and potentially have a lot more damage, because we're talking beginning of September now. We're not quite there in our corn development, and there is tremendous amount of pressure with environmental forecast for weeks to come to allow that pressure to continue. So we've enjoyed luxury of kind of learning from the south to a degree, but I think there's a lot that growers are going to learn about how severe this disease can be and how important management of it is as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Albert, Greg mentioned kind of the ability to kind of learn from the Southwest in terms of, the impact. I know the Southwest has kind of learned from the Midwest. There's been that progression of how it stormed through. Can you give me an idea, like what does that modeling show in terms of what are some of those conditions that a grower's got to be mindful of that, this could be impactful to my corn crop this year?
Yeah, the same conditions that favor us for other leaf diseases as well as Gibberella ear rot are very similar to what we see with tar spot, and hence why they overlap in many areas in that as well. So we talk about temperature. We always start talking about temperature. Temperature is one where those cooler or moderate temperatures are ideal based on the literature, but in reality, we've had really warm conditions this year. That may have slowed it down early on at the beginning, but now with the way tar spot is developing, even those higher temperatures, as we saw in 2021, really didn't slow down the epidemic or the development. So again, when those higher temperatures come in, it's critically important. It's better if it's early, slows down that initial infection. But once it starts to snowball, temperature is, in my opinion, not as important as what we start seeing about leaf wetness in particularly, and relative humidity drive a lot of it. And our leaf wetness is, we're only looking at 7 hours of leaf wetness, and primarily at night. And those conditions are quite common down here, anywhere near bodies of water, etc. And then that high relative humidity, that 75% or greater. And so those are pretty common ones. Think about white mold conditions, those foggy mornings, those dewy mornings, those also are very similar as well. And those monthly rain totals, if you start seeing accumulation of those rain events, but the rain events in many cases aren't quite as important as what we talk about leaf wetness and high relative humidity.
So then, John, as you've seen that progress through the Southwest, obviously, your advice to growers and grower strategies are going to have to change, or already are changing, in terms of how to manage tar spot. What are some of the things that you are talking as you meet with growers or hearing from growers that they are doing as kind of the key management strategies that need to be adopted to be able to manage tar spot?
Sure. Well, of course, first and foremost is that hybrid selection in the planning stages for the coming growing season, and we've spent We've spent a lot of time over the last several years learning how to score our material, as other companies have done as well. Understanding that tolerance level of your hybrid, what your pressure is going to be like in your general geography, and trying to gauge how you place hybrids across your farm is the first approach. And then from there, monitoring, typical agronomist answer here, scout, right? Like, you need to be scouting your crop. And we have seen infection, as early as late June. And you want to be aware of what kind of pressure you have. Do you need to be out there spraying as soon as you start to see a few stroma? No, but and fortunately, our timing has worked out where we typically get the biggest bang for our buck at that VT R1 stage of development, and that ties in nicely, for those in the province that are looking to manage the risk around Gibberella ear mold, which historically has been one of the major factors for growers here in Ontario.
Now, you mentioned Jib, and I do want to kind of put a pin in that, and I'm going to bring this up to you, Greg. Here's your warning that you're going to get the first question on Jib in a second. But Albert, I want to flip to you first, just to kind of, maybe build on what John has been talking about in terms of, the research that you're doing and what you're seeing. Kind of what else do growers need to think? Where do their management strategies need to line up with? And really, evolve and adapt very quickly for how rapidly it has come into the province, to be able to avoid that, as you talked about, 20, 30, 40 bushel losses if we don't do anything about it.
Yeah, and again, a lot of those are dependent on the environmental conditions, since it's a strong driver of this disease and other diseases. So important to be aware of what's going on environmentally, and do that based on the weather, environmental conditions. You can use some of the forecasting tools that are available, prediction model tools. All of those things can help guide us in terms of the risks. If you look at the Tar Spotter app right now, it's been red for a while, right? And we're seeing that increase risk factor there. So, but it's critically important that we can't really manage the weather. As much as we would love to, it's not going to happen, right? But you can understand your farm risks and manage those. And so, first of all, what's the risk? So in Greg's area, where we've seen that encroachment back and forth, we see tar spot every year, but are we going to see this year being that next level in that? And so that starts now, meaning you got to start planning about not only your field, your local history, that regional perspective. Think of Fusarium head blight, think of Gibberella ear rot, think of other diseases that are regional focus, right? So it's not specific just fields. The tolerance side, those susceptible versus tolerance. But also consider northern corn leaf blight as a disease we're seeing more of this year as well. Don't forget about those other packages. Remember other factors like standability, critically important for Greg's area and those silage producers. That impact a tar spot can have on silage and quality, and all those are critically important to those growers as well. And also, this disease also, and many diseases also try to hit those highest yield potential fields, right? Because of those environmental conditions that drive yield also make it much more favorable for disease. When it comes to the management side, as John mentioned, those VTR1 fungicide timings, and the good news is we've got a lot of good products that are very good at managing tar spot, rust, other of the foliar leaf diseases, as well as suppression on Gib and Dawn as well. So we have those tools available to us. John's comment about the timing and all that, and looking in different areas. Remember, be critical when you're looking at other recommendations and comments and where they're coming from. For growers in the Midwest and south of that, an early app and maybe a late app, post-tassel and pre-tassel applications may be effective for them on those two ends. But for Ontario, because of our risk from Gibberella ear rot, remember 2018, getting away from that VTR1 application is almost impossible. And the good news is that's been the most consistent and the biggest bang for your buck, as John mentioned, biggest return on investment and most consistency from a tar spot perspective. And we're also seeing more and more of the products that are coming out have multiple modes of action. So 2-way, 3 ways. So that gives you the broader perspective, potential in terms of longer residuals, but also better disease control as well.
Now, I said I wanted to go to Gib on you, Greg. I'm actually going to ask you one more question before we get to that, because Albert brought up the idea that because we do think of tar spot as impacting yield as being that big, kind of issue that we have, but he did mention silage quality, and it is one that, for me as somebody who is feeding livestock, obviously, that's another impact that I have to worry about. Can you talk just briefly on, what the quality impact is for anybody that is going to end up putting that corn into a bunker, into a silo?
Sure, absolutely. It's just another one of those dynamics we have to think about, right? And as we slip a little further north into the area I cover, livestock becomes a far bigger part of the conversation, and that silage piece is really important. And we talk a lot about yield being robbed in tar spot and the potential there, and that is real, right? We don't want to forget that part. But as you see that late infection continue too, and even if it comes in late and you're seeing that infection continue to spread, you may be far enough down the road with your ear development that you're not going to see a whole lot of loss from a yield standpoint or from a feed standpoint. The starch is not going to be hugely impacted. But what you will see is you'll see that infection shut down the plant. You'll see cannibalization of that plant to try to finish off that ear. And you'll see all of the good things that you want to feed in that ration stripped from it, leaving you all the high lignin content, the non-digestible fiber, and you'll see that skyrocket. And that will be the biggest challenge really from a quality standpoint. And if it gets far enough, Albert hit on standability, right? And standability, it's no fun to be picking up any corn when it starts to have standability issues. It's less fun when you're trying to get it chopped properly and into a bunk.
Now, what fits really well with you talk about you being in a very livestock heavy area is obviously that's where Gib comes into kind of a big perspective for you as well. An issue for all growers. They obviously don't want kind of high VOM levels in corn that's got to be sold. But for a lot of you're feeding chickens, you're feeding pigs, an issue that I know has been something you followed closely because of the impact it does have on your growers in your area. Can you talk about kind of how the conversation has evolved, similar to how we've talked about tar spot, over the last couple of years, and what you've seen as growers try to understand what the impact of Gib is on the quality of crop that's going to come off?
Yeah, so we over the last couple of years, well, not just the last couple of years, it's been a perennial problem for years in Ontario, Gib and Dawn development. And I like to kind of always talk the two, Gib and Dawn. The two are not mutually exclusive, but they're also kind of different issues to talk about, right? We just kind of finished talking about tar spot, and tar spot is a real challenging problem, right? With huge potential yield impacts. Thankfully doesn't have any real toxin associated with it, right? That's awesome. And some real management solutions that we have that are tangible that can allow the grower to go forward. Gib for us, as we've kind of battled with it for years and years in this province, in the Great Lake Basin, it's not just an Ontario problem, but the Great Lake Basin, really has been a frustrating disease. It is so much more complex than some of the leaf diseases in terms of our inability to come up with those demonstrable management tools that drive clear effect, right? We have some available to us, and we're really comfortable with those tools available to start limiting some Gib infection, to see Dawn suppression under certain conditions, but that's the best we're achieving, is that Dawn suppression piece. So we see years where we get wide impacts like 2018 that's fresh in all of our minds, right? But every year we see pockets where we struggle with Dawn in some areas, and there were limited areas last year, even through my area and John's area, that struggled again with Gib and higher Dawn levels than we would like to see. As we continue forward, I think we're starting to get a better handle on Gib, both in terms of the genetic standpoint. efforts kind of from the field. Some of the work that John and his reps and some of my reps have kind of been able to participate in under high pressure scenarios in the last few years have really helped us come to a better understanding of where our products sort. And thankfully, we've been empowered by Corteva and Pioneer to help commercialize products for the Ontario environment that are better on Gib resistance and performance, and we can show that in the field. So we've been able to move the needle in our own company in terms of our product performance there, but no hybrid ends up being perfect on Gib. There's conditions that end up being making them susceptible. And they're very similar to those same infection kind of environments that tar spot presents. Now it's a slightly more narrow window for that initial infection with Gib at that that tassel timing, that fresh silk channel infection is the biggest component. So that doesn't last for long, and if you don't have that environment at the same time, then we should be thankful for that, right? But if that environment presents itself at that time, then we can have complications from Gib. I think where some of the frustration on the grower end and the management end is that relationship between Gib and Dawn, where I mentioned them intentionally in both the same sentences, is always that Dawn piece is so unpredictable, right? I can have Gib, and yet predicting the level of Dawn is very, very difficult and reliant on so much more as the crop develops, right? Whether that's different ear dynamics, husk dynamics, the genetics in general, whether that's humidity in the canopy as you go through the season, that everything else seems to sort of impact Dawn in a way that we don't fully understand, in a way that we can't kind of model with potentially tar spot risk or even Gib risk itself. Dawn risk is complex.
Well, Albert, it sounds like Greg has a whole list of things for you to cover, because when we have challenges and we want more information, we look to you, Albert, to say, solve this problem for us. Give me an idea when we do talk about, the challenge, that Greg mentions in just being more complex in terms of trying to understand. What do you understand from it, to date now, and how is that impacting the information you're trying to gather to be able to translate to growers?
Yeah, so a lot of the things that Greg mentioned in that has been a frustration by all of us, and by no means am I the only one there, Andrew. There's a big team here and elsewhere as well. Dave Hooker and all our GFO and others in the Ontario AgriBusiness Association, et cetera, is part of this. But Greg's whole idea around those environmental factors, the hybrid characteristics, et cetera, are a big piece that is basically throws a wrench in it every year, right? And in some cases, this should be a lot of Dawn or Gib, and it's not. And then where you think it wasn't, it is. So there's all of that. So we're trying to go at some of the different activities around some of that to try to solve some of that. So one of them is a lot of work around trying to develop a Dawn cast for corn, trying to help sort of like a tar spotter one in that. So there's work in the US, there's work here with Dave Hooker and I, and that as well, trying to develop something that can help us narrow it down a little bit and go with that side of things, that variability in terms of the hybrids and that I think we've become much better at more reliable screening methods, Greg and John, I think you'd agree with, in terms of both public and private. So I think we're all work together to get those screening methods. And we talked about susceptibility for tar spot, and Greg just talked about susceptibility for Gib and Dawn as well. And I think one of the focuses there is that we've always gone for the best, the resistant, the tolerance. And I always call it the holy grail. And we're not going to get the holy grail when it comes to that resistance for Dawn, because there's different types of resistance play a factor here and that. But we can look at those susceptible hybrids. So we can go on the bottom side there. And if we remove more of those susceptible hybrids from growers' fields and that, and introduce and slowly bring that base resistance up or tolerance, that helps us too. So we can do it both ways. And I think we're making progress there. And we were fortunately able this past year to get out the hybrid testing through the Ontario Corn Performance Trials. There, the Corn Committee as well.
So, John, it actually sounds like the management strategies, to better handle or better protect against jib, sound very similar to that against tar spot too. And it really is those line up well, that we might be able to protect that corn crop. Kind of two birds with one stone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the one thing that I think about as I listen to Greg and Albert is, what our ultimate goal is to manage our risk, right, around both of these diseases. And in your first line of defense, it is hybrid selection. We rely on our breeders and our research organizations to characterize these diseases to the best of their ability. There isn't any silver bullets, unfortunately, but we have learned, certainly in southwestern Ontario, we have learned how to manage both of these diseases to a great degree, and I'm looking forward to some of the new technologies that the researchers are going to have access to in the coming years, where maybe we can hone in on the vomitoxin side of things from a jib standpoint. Maybe there will be better, more efficient ways to evaluate the levels of vomitoxin, and that will help us speed up our ability to screen material and find those products that are going to reduce the risk even further for customers in the marketplace. We can't change where we farm, and we will always have the Great Lakes surrounding us. And I think as the problem is a little bit bigger and covers a greater area, there's more focus, and we are making progress, which feels good.
Mm-hmm.
So then, Albert, when John talks about that progress, kind of what are the next steps in your mind, whether it be from, you and that large team that you do mention, that is looking into this, whether it's, agronomists like Greg and John, whether it's breeders, whether it's me as a producer, what does progress look like over the next couple of years so we can better manage both tar spot, Gibberella ear rot, any disease that we're facing? What do we all need to do together?
Yeah, I think that is, I love the way you put it together. And I think that is something we've seen with both Ontario, both the government as well, or the public and the researchers, as well as the industry, as well as our groups in the U.S., tar spot working group, the corn disease working groups, our Dawn and Gibberella working group in Ontario, all of those working together. But again, it all, when it comes to disease management, regardless of the disease, it always starts with genetics. And that is critically important, understanding the needs for your farm and for each of those different fields. And again, as we talked about differences between a field crop grain producer versus, say, a dairy silage, where silage is critically important, both of those. And for both of these diseases as well, right, Greg, in terms of Dawn has an impact on that silage component as well, right? If we don't have those conditions favorable, we could have a really good crop going in there, but when it comes down to using it, it changes quite quickly. And that could be an impact from a crop that was usable to non-usable in silage and that side of things. So I think on that, getting better, more consistencies in terms of our hybrid ratings, remove more of those susceptible hybrids, critically important. We got to understand how this disease, the mechanisms involved, and versus silk channel infection versus kernel spread infection. There's multiple different angles. And from a breeding perspective, that's really difficult. You target one, but inadvertently, something else maybe becomes weaker or becomes more susceptible, and it just jumps over. So Mother Nature can always throws us curves and continues on that way. But the good news is we're making more progress along those lines. We also have to, and we are looking at new products, testing new products that can help supplement that genetic tolerance and that in terms of new fungicides, new active ingredients. Many of the crop protection companies are looking at new tools there. I think from a timing standpoint, that VTR1 application timing, John mentioned, how tight that window is. I think that window is getting larger. That's a good thing that we're starting to see too. We're also seeing, silk development, and that the duration and variability of that silking really plays a factor in how much dawn or jib we may have as well, right? So a more variable field, the higher the risk on that side of things. So we're seeing some of the hybrids now having a longer green silk period, for instance. That is good in terms of making sure pollination, et cetera, especially if there's environmental factors involved there. But that gives us maybe a bigger window for that fungicide application as well. And I think, that target days now, that 6 to 8 days after silking, or that sweet spot for a fungicide application, we're seeing that those what we would have called later applications are actually effective as well. So that gives us that window. Again, that big push to try to get product on, or those acres covered in such a short time frame, has always been a bottleneck. And hopefully we can do that. And again, new technology, whether it's ground rigs versus aerial, the drone side of things down the road potentially may be a factor as well. All of those, and then you tie in all that disease forecasting and all that. And remember, when it comes to assessing your risks, that hybrid side of things is critically important. That field variability, those temperatures. And so we were talking prior to coming on here about those really hot temperatures, those upper 20s to 30s, and that, white mold is a good example, where we still have white mold this year in soybeans in certain parts, say in the Southwest or so, but the level of disease in over most of it slowed down a bit because of those higher temperatures, those 30-degree temperatures or more. Those are also ones that reduce Gibberella irrot. So from a moisture standpoint, and that might be favorable, temperatures might come back in and lower that risk for us as well.
Well, guys, I love the fact that we've had, I've had each of you on, over the last few years to talk about, how we can kind of strategize on dealing with some of these issues. And the reality is that when we have a conversation like this and bring up this topic again, we have made progress in the last couple of years. We have learned lessons, and honestly, I can't wait till we can do this again, kind of in the future, and have learned some more to be able to provide, growers and reps and everybody else with more information so that we can better manage that. So Greg, John, Albert, thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And that does it for this episode. We've got a great lineup of fall episodes coming your way. So if you haven't already, head to your favorite podcast app and subscribe so you don't miss out whenever we add new content. You can also find video versions on YouTube. Just search the Corteva Canada channel. And if you'd like to stay in touch, you can always follow Pioneer Seeds on X at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA, or me at Fresh Air Farmer. And don't forget, if you're ever looking for more information or advice, just ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.